It's happening. It's pretty common. Everyone, Bryn NAM.
Morning. Thanks for having me. I'm an author-illustrator. I was an illustrator for about 25 years and an author-illustrator for the last 10. I'm here in Boston to talk about my book, The Genius of Islam, which came out in 2011. I've talked across the U.S. at about 25 different venues. I talked at the World Trade Center Mosque, the 9/11 Mosque. I've talked at World Affairs Councils, churches, libraries, middle schools, and I've gotten one hostile comment in the entire time. So I've come to the conclusion that Islamophobia is a media-driven phenomenon, because that's not what I've experienced in this. So you might wonder why I wrote this book. When I was in high school, I was an exchange student to Malaysia. I lived with a Muslim family near Singapore. It was an awesome experience. And after 9/11, when a lot of anti-Islamic stuff started coming out in newspapers, I'm not a Muslim, but I felt that it was sort of it was payback time for me for all of the hospitality and friendship I'd gotten in Malaysia. So I proposed to my publisher, Random House, this idea of this book, and they talked to librarians. And librarians say, yes, there's a need for this book in the middle school range, and that's what I write. I write books for. My specialty is nonfiction books for middle school kids. That's my niche. That's my brand. That's how I sell myself. Every author, if you look at the book market, it's very segmented: 2 to 4, 4 to 6, 6 to 8, and this particular area is the oldest you can really go and still have pictures in books. And I'm at base an illustrator, a painter, a drawer. I like doing pictures, and I like incorporating them into books. And so this was as high as I could go, and still have illustrations in my books. I also love to write, and I love nonfiction. I love history, and I try to get my passion for history into these books. And this is a book not about Islam the religion, but about Islamic civilization and its deep historical connections to the West, which pretty much have been forgotten, long acknowledged for centuries up until about the 1500s, and then forgotten. And so I talk about what the connections are in art, philosophy, engineering, medicine, astronomy, architecture, food, and then why we don't know about any of that anymore. Because if you look at a middle school text, and it talks about Islamic civilization, it pretty much says Rome fell, Muslims translated all the knowledge of the Greco-Roman world into Arabic, sat on it for 1,000 years, gave it back to the Europeans after the Renaissance, and then that's pretty much it. You might get a paragraph or a page, but that's more or less the gist. Scholars have known for a long time that none of this is like original research, this is secondary research, that the connections are much deeper and broader than that. And so that's what this book tries to do. And it uses the National Geographic format. I worked for National Geographic and NASA during my years as a freelancer, where you have compelling images, fascinating captions, and succinct text. So you go from pictures to captions to text, and lots of air, so that you can read this book in probably 45 minutes, or half an hour if you're a fast reader. And then and at the back I have a pretty thorough bibliography with websites and everything in here I painted. All the maps I did in Photoshop and Illustrator. I did the initial layout for this, and then I worked with a designer at Random House to make it. If you wonder why it's so thin, a color picture book like this, for it to sell for under $20, it has to be less than 48 pages. 48 pages or less. Parents don't like to spend more than $20 on a book for their kids. So you go over that price and the sales plummet. So that's why. So I had to learn to write very succinctly, pack a lot of information into each sentence, but not so much information that it was daunting. The vocabulary has to be at a certain level. The images have to be very accessible. Some of the chapters in this book I wrote 5 and 6 times. When the editor said, "I have no idea what you're talking about. If I don't understand it, a middle schooler isn't going to understand it." So that's the story of this book. Sales have been brisk. It's been translated into Arabic. We're looking at it being translated into Malay Indonesian. It's been probably, of all the books that I've written and illustrated, it's probably been the most successful and had the most impact. Got me here to Boston. So from Kuwait, which is where I'm living now. I've been here for the last year and a half. I want to write other books about the Islamic world. I want to write more books about Islamic history, and all of my experience had been in Southeast Asia. And to have street cred, to really talk about Islam in its fullness, I really needed to spend time in the Middle East. I got an opportunity to teach at the American International School in Kuwait and jumped on it, and so I teach in the International Baccalaureate program there for like I said, the last year and a half. So other books that I've written and illustrated is this book, Outbreak, Plagues That Change History. I did another one, which is Dangerous Planet, Natural Disasters That Change History. You can sort of see a theme here, history and cool, amazing things that happened then. And this is sort of like history's biggest traffic accidents. I don't know if they do it up here in Boston, but I used to live in New Jersey, and every time there was a traffic accident, they would talk about a gaper delay. The people are going down the freeway going, looking at the accident. So these are like history's biggest gaper delays that just so slow you down, take a look, and that gives me an opportunity to dive in and give you some information so that you can then, because Americans are famously uninterested in history. We're a young, forward-looking country, but they say that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. I think Iraq and Afghanistan is a testament to that. So I want people to understand a little more deeply our connections with the past, the ripple effects of the past that are still affecting us now. So I put together a little slideshow just to show you a little more in fuller aspect of my career and sort of how this connects to art education, and then I guess there's time for questions. Right? So one of the things that I do before I go into this is, while I've been living in overseas, and I've done this here, is I do author-illustrator visits. And this is one of the ways that I've taken this, and I'm not just selling the book and getting royalties from the book, but I'm leveraging it into another means of making money, and also getting the word out about my books. International schools, the whole the complex of international schools all over the world, the American international schools, American schools, they all have author visits, author-illustrator visits, typically 2 to 4 a year. And they're always looking for new material. So I pitched my idea in a basically about a one-page, if typed out it would be about one-page email that I just mass mailed to schools in Europe and Asia. And I think I sent out about 75 of them, and I got one response from one librarian in Budapest who connected me to another librarian in Warsaw, who connected me to another librarian in Zagreb, who connected me to another librarian in Sofia, and that was my first tour. And then from that, someone heard about me in Helsinki, and then I went to Stockholm, and then I went to the International Librarians Conference this year in Oman, and in each one of those places, more people hear my talks like this, and I have one talk for each of my books. And then I have another talk called Creativity Confidential, which is sort of about the inside story about how I write and illustrate books. And I'm going to show you a couple of images from that just to give you an idea of the sort of the flavor of those kind of talks. And they're typically about an hour long, 50 minutes, 45 minutes, gives time for the talk and for questions from students. And I go everywhere from pre-K up to 12th grade, and then also sometimes to college and adult audiences, PTAs, whoever's willing to listen to me. So it's Creativity Confidential, how I developed an author brand. And I start with this image. I actually sent this to Nadim yesterday, and this is a typical art school pitch. To get students who are in high school to be interested in going to art school, and it sort of uses the whole, your kids on drugs kind of thing, but substituting art for drugs.
The one on the bottom right says, "I learned art from you, Mom."
Yeah. It was a clever pitch that was a lot of art schools used. When I was in art school, there was a comic, a graphic novel that came out called Art School Confidential. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. It was made into a movie, and this was my favorite panel from this. Rare is the pragmatist among art school professors. Only very occasionally do you come across someone who is willing to level with students about their bleak prospects. Only one student out of 100 will find work in his chosen field. The rest of you are essentially wasting your time learning useless hobbies. And then they're all saying, "I'll be that one." That was, I had a pragmatist teacher like that, and he said, if you want to be that one, you've got to be the best at what you do. And so when I got into art school, I was astonished at how much better, I wanted to be an illustrator. I was astonished at how much better everyone at drawing was. I was like the best draftsman in my high school, and I was probably the worst draftsman in Art Center. So I said, well, I've got to practice. So I took Saturday art classes, evening art classes, drew and drew and drew and drew and drew, and by the end, I was in the top tier of people coming out of there. But that was by recognizing a deficit and then fixing it. So there's lots of ways of becoming an artist. You can be like Edgar Degas and have rich parents to support you. You can marry into wealth. You can be miserable and lonely, and like Vincent van Gogh, and then after you die, your paintings can be worth millions. Or you can be like my neighbor in art school, Thomas Kincaid, and the painter of light, who had an erring eye for popular taste. And he was penniless in art school and was worth $600 million when he died last year. I chose to go a sort of different route, and it's and branding myself as a nonfiction illustrator of books for middle schoolers. So Dangerous Planet, Outbreak, and The Genius of Islam are the 3 books that I wrote and illustrated, but to get to that point, I had to do lots of other things. I started out being a science fiction paperback book illustrator. I went into sort of fantasy books. This 3rd book there was a fantasy written by an 80-year-old count from Germany about an 80-year-old count from Germany who goes to the Amazon where he becomes a god that's worshipped by young women. So then I did books for Time Life Books and Space Fairs, all of this. And you can see that the style is pretty consistent through here. It's realistic, representational, painting mostly in oil. And then as time went on, I started incorporating more and more digital imagery into what I did. But I love to paint, and so if I can find any excuse to get people to pay me to paint, then I take it. Then this was Japan's, the Japanese version of The Wizard of Oz, Ginga Tetsudo no Yoru, the Night of the Milky Way Railway, and I did the first English translation of that. Started moving into things with more cultural content. And then these are young adult novels. These are 2 sort of novels of powerful young women. For one, a prehistoric woman, and one sort of the Indiana Jones of the Mayan world. And then an illustrated Genesis. And then here's where I did actually my very first full-color illustrated book, where I was where I was getting to the whole package, the cover, all the color illustrations, the entire, and it was nonfiction. This was a book about an amusement park in Baltimore that used to be a rival to Coney Island that went out of business in World War II and then was taken over by the forest, and now you'd never know there was ever anything there. And then this is a series of books this book here, Gorillas, Gentle Giants of the Forest, is still in print. It's sold about 300,000 copies at about $4 a piece. So I was paid initially about a $5,000 advance for this book, and it's made over, I think, $35,000 in royalties over the years. That was the very first book I did where I had a royalty arrangement. Other books before this, it was all a flat fee. Typically, when you're doing covers for books, you're paid a flat fee. It's a short relationship. You do the art, you give them the art, and that's the end of it. But with advance against royalties like Gorillas, Gentle Giants of the Forest, it's ongoing as long as the book stays in print. And books like this, parents want their kids to read. It's inexpensive, so there's really no barrier to this staying in print essentially forever. However, I've done 5 of these books, and this one, Tentacles, Tales of the Giant Squid, also has sold very, very well. So that means that I got my advance. The advance was a little higher in this one. It was about $8,000. And within 6 months, that had all been paid back by sales of the book, and now I've probably made about 20, I think, on royalties of that book. So twice a year, I get a check from Random House about this. But there's several other books. I did one on ostriches. I did one on chameleons. I did another one on the Lascaux Caves, and they haven't done nearly as well. In fact, some of them maybe my great-grandchildren might see royalties on them, because it's a mystery. It's a mystery to me, and I think it's a mystery to the people I work with at Random House. Which one of these books? Chameleon seems like a great idea. Everybody loves chameleons. Well, not enough to buy books in this. And who would know that giant squid are as popular as gorillas in the parent book buying world? Sold, this is also done very well. This is a book for another publisher, Charles Bridge, and this is a story about a boy who goes to an auction and loses about 100 years of his allowance by putting his hand up at the wrong time. Dinosaurs, this is a picture book, and this book this is an interesting phenomenon. If you've ever been to a bookstore and seen the Ology series of books that's put out by Candlewood Press, Egyptology, Fairyology, Dragonology, they sell for $20. They sell for just a little bit more than this book, but they are packed with pop-ups and pull-outs and all sorts of gewgaws and doodads. Kids love these books. And parents love them too because they're inexpensive. They would not exist except that they're assembled in China for 16 cents an hour. They're the books depend on very inexpensive labor. And they also depend on being produced in gigantic amounts before they ever make a profit. So this was a book put out by Intervisual, which at one time was the biggest pop-up book publisher on earth. And then with the advent of video games, they went bankrupt. They were bought by a publisher in southern US, Anderson Publishing. And this was an attempt to reboot them. And Dinosaurs was an attempt to be a competitor to the Ology series. It was one of several books that they came out with. It sold for under $20, very lavish, with a cover that's textural, and it has an eye of the dinosaur that comes out of the book. And it was 75 paintings that I did. It was a gorgeous book. They printed 50,000 copies. It was only after those 50,000 they would start making a profit, and we sold 49,500 copies. So with all of that and all the effort into it, it did not make the kind of profit. So it was not reprinted, although it's still in print in Portuguese, if any of you read Portuguese. And finally, this is a phenomenon that's with changes in publishing. Publishing is going through radical restructuring with the advent of ebooks, with the advent of the changes, the ability of people not to have to go to publishers, but to be able to actually print their own books through organizations like CreateSpace, which is an arm of Amazon. This does on-demand book publishing, where you can create your own book, upload it to Amazon, and then they sell books one by one. So if you want to buy a book, they print one. If you want to buy a book, they print 2 and 3 and 4. As opposed to this book, where 10,000 were printed, and they sit in a warehouse until they're bought. So this is offset printed, which is the traditional way of doing books. And you have to print lots of them before you start making money. There's a lot of initial setup costs, setting up the presses, setting up the inks, all that kind of stuff. And so to make 10,000 of these costs almost as much as it does to make 20,000 of these. But in the case of on-demand books, there are no setup costs because you're just printing the books one at a time. That's really changing. That's changing publishing. And of course, now with the Kindle and the Nook and the other kinds of e-readers, that's really changing reading. Amazon now sells more books as Kindle books than it does of actual printed books. Their profits are coming more from that area. I have a Kindle. I read it. It's great for traveling. So, even though I want you all to buy these kind of books, I like reading those kind of books. And if you go to an airport today, just look around. Everybody has a Kindle or an iPad or something that they're doing their reading on. So, publishers are struggling to figure out a way that they don't end up like the music industry. Interestingly, with the music industry, I recently in Kuwait, in my classroom, one of my students came in and they said, "Sir," because they call you sir and miss there, "Sir, I found your book on Pirate Bay." It's like, and I told them that I was an author and illustrator, and they go, yeah, author, illustrator. But once I was on Pirate Bay, I was legit. So I contacted Random House, and that meant, this means the book's being downloaded and I'm getting a penny. And I think there were 60 books had been downloaded in a day, from various places around the world from Pirate Bay. So or the Pirate Bay. So I contacted Random House, and they sent a takedown letter to Pirate Bay, and now the book is no longer on there. So I'm not legit anymore. But people are, when they get my book, I actually make some money on it. And that's a challenge. I have a friend of my daughter's about your age, and he goes to Evergreen College, and he has a Kindle. And the first time I'd seen a Kindle, and I said, "What do you got on there, Stefan?" And he says, "Oh, I've got all my textbooks here." And I said, "How much do they cost?" "Cost? I didn't pay for them." And so he did. He went to 4 years of university, didn't buy a single textbook. They were all downloaded from various hubs elsewhere. And so that, of course, is a challenge to authors, especially professors who like to make, the 36th edition of French 1 and the 37th and the 38th and make you buy those new editions every time. So that's a big change and a challenge to publishers. So it took all of that to get me to get me to this. And so I spent 20 years doing this. I didn't actually realize I wanted to be an author. I wasn't pining to write and illustrate books. But I actually had an art director at Random House who I would come in with my portfolio. I'm sure you've heard what freelance artists do. You go around with your portfolio, I'd knock on the door, show her my work, or I'd email her copies of my stuff. And she said, if you wrote and illustrated a book, you would have more control over your product. You'd be deciding what kind of images you wanted to do. You'd have control of the story. You'd be building yourself not just as a vendor, but as a creator. And so with that, that's why I wrote Dangerous Planet. And I said, well, what kind of book do you think would be you'd get behind? And she says, well, I think disasters are something that would be something that kids would like to read. This art director's name is Isabel Warren Lynch, and so I said, okay, I'm interested in history. How about the history of disasters? And so our book, and I really say it's our book because even though I wrote and illustrated it, I worked very closely with my art director. I worked very closely with an editor, and developed the book from there. It's a cooperative process to write and illustrate a book. So that's that's sort of the basics of what I do. Do you have any questions?
Just give you a I'm sure we will. What is it like working on projects that don't seem like you own them? How is it different from the early ones versus the later ones?
Oh, okay.
And then how can you accelerate, if indeed your object or your target is getting to the ones where you own the creative process, how do you accelerate that?
Oh, early on? Well, yeah. How do you switch from what I did early?
As quickly as possible.
Well, yeah, as quickly as possible. I think the world of art and commercial art has changed a lot. I really aspired to doing paperback book illustrations. I had teachers at Art Center that were doing this, and I thought that would be a great thing to do. And even though I liked picture books, I didn't really see myself as a writer illustrator initially. But once I got into doing illustrating books, I realized that I really wasn't a good fit for science fiction fantasy paperbacks. It really wasn't me. I have friends who work really well. In fact, one of the very first art directors I talked to, he said, "You should really be in children's books." And I said, "But I want to do science fiction fantasy." He says, "There's something about you that really is better for a younger market." And if I'd listened to him early on, this voice of wisdom, I probably wouldn't have spent the next 10 years continuing doing this other thing, because I've had a lot more success in this world than I did in that world. It was a lot. I was twice a year flying out to New York, going around seeing book publishers. Initially, it would take me about a week to visit all the different book publishers. Make appointments, go visit them. By the time, within 10 years, that had shrunk down to basically 3 buildings that I visited, and many of those publishers had turned into a cubicle in a much larger conglomerate, as there was this giant consolidation. Essentially now there's Penguin, Putnam, and and Random House, which there's been merger upon merger upon merger upon merger, and they're owned by big conglomerates too, and that's really changed the nature of just the way publishing works. So for me, to answer your question, I think identifying what you want to do early on, I changed what I wanted to do. And I think that was part of it. But I think listening to voices of people of more experience. The reason I went to Art Center is I got into Pratt, and I got doing communication design, and I got into Art Center to do illustration, and I got into the University of Washington to do a PhD in anthropology, and I didn't know what to do. And so I went to an art director, a designer that I respected, and he said, "What makes you happiest?" And painting and drawing made me happiest. And so he said, "Well, that's really what you should do." So that's why I chose illustration, because I just love the feel of paint, and I love the feel of a pencil in my hand, and it's very therapeutic doing that. And you can just sort of get into the zone where you're just sort of working away there. Time just sort of evaporates, and I love that aspect of things. So identifying what you want to do and then following that. I think we always say to students, find your passion, follow your passion. But that's the assumption that there's a passion. My passion I have many passions. I love history, I love art, I love writing, I love travel, I love education, I like teaching. I love being in the classroom and getting the interaction I do with students. So the career that I've sort of evolved kind of combines all of those things. But it took me a while to identify. I mean, I didn't think of myself as a teacher initially. And I went to Southeast Asia. I worked in some ad agencies in Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta right out of art school. And in Jakarta, I had to teach. It was a requirement of my visa. And I discovered, hey, I'm pretty good at this, you know. So, and I went on from there. So that was not something that I went into education doing. Yeah.
Before you started illustrating your own books, how would you handle clients that you didn't want to actually like draw specific things for?
Oh, you mean like it's always a negotiation. It's always a negotiation. You know, if you don't, and that kind of goes back to I think answering your question, Nadim, about when you're working for somebody else. I mean, I recognize I'm going to invest a certain amount of myself. It's a commercial transaction. I'm presenting myself as a product. They're buying the product. They're expecting the work to look something like this. They're not expecting me to do something like Linda Berry, or Tom Tomorrow. They want it to look like this. So I give them what they expect, but I'll give them a lot of versions of it. There's always a process of thumbnails, sketches, comprehensives, and as we winnow things down so that by the time they get the final product, they know what they're going to get, and ideally it's better than they think they're going to get. Because you're only as good in the freelance world, you're only as good as your last job. And if you do something for a client and they're unhappy with it, that will be the last job you do for that client. So, and I had experiences like that where, for whatever reason, I misunderstood what they wanted. And I was told in art school that art directors would rather work with someone who's a middling talent but easy to work with than a brilliant talent who's a prima donna. And so I've made an effort to be agreeable and flexible and without compromising my values, but give art directors what they want. Now, when I'm in this position where I'm writing and illustrating, there's still a lot of negotiation that goes on. Like, for example, there were chapters that I wanted to put in the Genius of Islam that I couldn't put in. There just wasn't room. And in this, I really wanted to write a chapter on malaria. Malaria has probably killed more diseases than any disease on earth. I couldn't write it as a story with a beginning and a middle and an end that I could fit into the number of pages I needed here. It's sort of this slow killer. So virtually everything in here is an epidemic that has a start and rising action, climax, falling action. It's a story. And so the book is peculiar in that way. So I've never been in the position of just being an artist on my own where I'm completely in charge of the entire show. I'm always dependent on other people to work with me and make my work better than it could be on my own. And I appreciate the input that I get from my editor, from my art director, from my designer. I did a design for this book and a design for this book that I thought were awesome. I thought this is going to be, no one could do better than this. And my designer came up with these way better than I could have done. I'm a better illustrator than I am a designer. And I realized out of that I should hand this over to people who are better than at what they do than I am. I give them ideas, but then they improve on them.
Designer, you mean layout?
Yeah, layout. Yeah, So the graphic designer designs the font. There was a decision made early on to have this sans serif font and this font that looks like Ralph Steadman wrote it. And so several of the books, as you see here, they have this kind of similar look. That was decided early on so that they would sort of fit together. Although you notice this is smaller. One of the reasons it's smaller is it costs less to produce a book that's much smaller. This is a little bit oversized, and it costs just putting that much more on adds to the cost of doing the books. And every penny is looked at in the production of books like this. So, and then the other unsung people I work with are copy editors. And the difference, if you wonder, what's the difference between self-publishing your book and going to someone like CreateSpace at Amazon or Lightning Source, which is Ingram's on-demand arm, and having a publisher do it? Well, at Random House, there's an army of copy editors that go over my type. It's a cliche, but with a fine-tooth comb, they really do go over it. And I think the text is perfect, and they check every date to make sure that it's right. They check my commas, they check my punctuation, they check every fact that I have in there, and I get my manuscript back full of typed on pages with comments, and they get very enthusiastic. What about this? Add this. What about that? Why couldn't you put that in there? But they also point out that I've made errors along the way, and then I fix things and I send it back, and then I get it back again, and there's more, and it goes through again and again and again. I typically, this is what's called a BLAD, which means bound layout and design, and this is what's used to sell a book to book chains and to bookstores and to book buyers. And so before the book actually comes out, you get this very small version, which just kind of gives you a taste of the book. And so, and this is not all that different from what the actual the galleys look like. The galleys are, that's the book before it actually goes into print. They look like this, and they're covered with blue pencil, green pencil, red pencil from all the different copy editors that have gone through again and again and again. And not until there's no pencil marks does this ever go into press. And even with all that, this book has a mistake in it. There's an error in it that no one caught, and I only found, oh no, after it comes out. So we had to fix that.
So would you suggest a student, like if you have a small art book that you want to do for children, would you suggest shopping publishing houses or trying something like Amazon at first? What do you suggest for the first step?
I think it's good. I think now with the ability of CreateSpace and Lightning Source to get your work out there in front of them, lots of publishers are looking at people that are self-publishing. I think her name is Amanda Peak, I think it is, who sold. She tried to go the traditional publishing route and didn't work for her. So she went to bookstores and looked at what was selling, and she says, I could write a vampire book. And so she wrote a vampire book and self-published it. And it was done as an ebook, and in the first week there was 1 hit, and then 2 and 3 and 5 and 10 and 20 and 100 and 1,000 and 10,000 and 100,000. She sold 1 million copies of this book at $1 a piece, and now it's been picked up. I think it's by HarperCollins. I'm not sure. Now it's been picked up by a traditional publisher. Now, not everybody can do that. Not everybody can be J.K. Rowling. Not everybody can be like the Wachowski brothers. I think it's disingenuous to use examples of that, of singular phenomena like that as, well, we should all aspire to be like that, because circumstances were right for J.K. Rowling and for her books, and right for Amanda Peak and her books. But I think that getting your book out and seeing what kind of response there is, encouraging people to read it and review it, trying to get some buzz about the book is a good, and then going to publishers and saying, here's my book, and they can actually see what it looks like as a packaged product. It's a lot easier for anyone to imagine what a book is going to sell like if they can actually see it. That's why before it gets to this point, one of the things that I do, on any book I do 3 chapters. I do a painting of what the cover is going to look like, and then I do something called a dummy, which is basically a layout of the book where I put, this is where I think text is going to go, and I'll do quick sketches of this is where I think the images are going to go. And who knows what the future is going to be if people are actually going to continue reading physical books like this. But more books are being produced today than ever before. The book market keeps expanding despite all of the challenges I just talked about. So I'm hoping I keep writing and illustrating, and I would encourage you to try the fact that we now have this ebook market and this on-demand market. This last book here, that was an on-demand book, and I just illustrated a book. It's actually a story called The Princess and the Butterfly, which is an ebook for Kindle that doesn't even exist as an actual physical book. It's just an ebook, and I think it sells for like $2.99, and that's selling at a good clip too. So, yeah.
Do you still paint as a hobby?
I sure do. Yeah. I carry a sketchbook with me wherever I go, and especially when I travel. That's how when I'm waiting for planes or sitting around waiting for to meet someone. I just like to draw what I see. I have a studio set up wherever I live. I always have a studio, and I paint there. I like to paint. It's representational. Even if I'm doing fantasy stuff, it tends to be representational. But yeah, I paint for fun. There was a guy who came to Art Center. He was someone like me who came into the classroom, and he was an amazing illustrator. And he asked that question. So what do you do in your own time? He says, I cook. He says, you don't paint? We were horrified. He said, no, it's a job. I don't. And we were like, he's lost the passion. And so yeah, I live and breathe art.